Good afternoon and welcome to the second session of this conference on Islam, Israel and the Church. And after the presentation about the Church and Israel, we'll now turn to look at the position of Israel, particularly in relation to Islam. And obviously the global implications of this theme are quite significant in the context of the developments currently going on throughout the Middle East, particularly in Syria and Iraq. In this session, I want to focus on the question of Palestinian statehood and the so-called occupied territories. Now, why and how is this issue of Palestine relevant to Islam? Well, here are some examples. The US Secretary of State, John Kerry, very recently in his attempt to revive the peace talks, was careful to say that in his discussions with all the Arab states throughout the Middle East, there was a consistent emphasis on resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict as a precondition to solving the development of ISIS and radical Islam in the area. The fact that the Palestine-Israel conflict has not been resolved is seen as provoking tensions within the region. A second example, Palestinian Authority television recently broadcast an interview with Sheikh Kamal Khatib, deputy leader of the Islamic movement in Israel, who outspokenly stated that Jerusalem will be the capital not only of a Palestinian state, but also of a coming Islamic caliphate. In other words, Jerusalem is seen quite clearly, in the eyes of some at any rate, as being critical to the development of Islam throughout the region. A third example, the Organisation of Islamic Conference has consistently, since the early 70s, put the question of Palestinian statehood very centrally on its agenda. And it's been pretty much item number one of the 51 member states of the Islamic Conference to see the development of a Palestinian state. Finally, we've seen in recent months, certainly since the Gaza conflict in the summer of the Northern Hemisphere, a great increase in anti-Semitic incidents, demonstrations in which Palestine and Islam have been connected. So now at face value, the two-state solution seems like a perfect resolution of this seemingly intractable conflict. Two states for two people living side by side. So why shouldn't that be the case? Well, I want to argue in this presentation that the international community at this point in time should only recognise Palestine as a state and enforce the creation of that state if this results from a full and final peace agreement between Israel and its neighbours based on mutual recognition, respect and negotiations. Failing negotiations, a Palestinian state should not be recognised at this point in time. Now, I want to emphasise very much at the outset that a vote against Palestinian statehood is not a vote against the Palestinian people. There is terrible suffering on all sides in this conflict, and we all see that only too well. In our view, imposing the wrong remedy to meet these situations will only make matters worse. And I want to come to talk about the proposal that is being on the table at the moment, put by the Palestinian Authority. We need to distinguish between the civil and religious rights and freedoms of individual Arab Palestinian people, and on the other side, the political rights of the Arab Palestinians as a whole. Now, one of the myths that has been stimulated, I think largely by the modern media, which focuses on individual problems, is that this is a conflict between Israel on the one side, or even the Jews, and Palestinians, especially Arab Palestinians, on the other. This is a conflict between two people who seem to hate each other. Well, I would argue the conflict is both broader and deeper than that implies. It's broader because the conflict, to my mind, involves not just the Palestinian people, but Israel and all of its neighbours throughout the region. It is called an Israel-Palestine conflict, but it remains very much and Israel-Arab conflict. It's deeper also in the sense that there is a religious or spiritual dimension to this conflict, which is often overlooked. Now, Palestinian statehood in the current circumstances in the Middle East will not advance the prospects of real and lasting peace in the region. In fact, I don't believe it will serve the interests of either Israel or the Palestinian people. What is real and lasting peace in the Middle East? Well, it involves a number of things, I think, and more than the absence of hostility. We've seen ceasefires over the last decades which haven't lasted in peace. The first criterion, I think, or condition of true peace is mutual recognition and respect. We will never have peace in the region if the parties themselves do not mutually recognise and respect and indeed value the existence of the others. So the acceptance and embracement of the other as valuable and worthy of existence. Thirdly, the protection of secure and defensible borders is an absolute condition sine qua non in this conflict. So none of these conditions is present in the Palestinians' current initiative. And we'll go now to look at what that initiative is. So what's the current situation in relation to Palestinian statehood? Well, President Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority and of the PLO has announced in mid-October that he intends to seek a resolution in the United Nations Security Council which will require Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories. So it's still a draft resolution which hasn't been formally presented yet. But the draft that we have seen, we understand, demands that the full withdrawal of Israel, the occupying power, as it's called, from all of the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, as rapidly as possible and to be fully completed within a specified time frame, perhaps even as early as November 2016. As well as the achievement of the independence and sovereignty of the State of Palestine and the right to determination of the Palestinian people. So this resolution is basically pushing forward and requiring implementation of Palestinian statehood and calling for the United Nations to implement that statehood. Now, already over 130 nations since 1988 have officially recognised Palestine as a state. So what's new? Well, what's new is that this is for the first time the Security Council will be called upon to actually enforce the borders of this Palestinian state and the sovereignty of the Palestinian people over that state. Now, European nations so far have refused to recognise Palestine as a state. We've seen some movement from that in recent weeks. For example, Sweden and the proclamation of the UK Parliament speaking out very much in favour of Palestinian statehood. Nevertheless, there's been a number of states which refuse to recognise Palestine without negotiations. For example, the Nordic Council. And of course, Australia has been very strong in saying that there will be no Palestinian recognition without negotiations. Now, the Palestinians have also made a bid for UN membership. That's official membership of the UN, which they're not yet. They are an unofficial non-member of the UN. And this is still on the table of the UN Security Council. In effect, what they're doing now is a kind of backdoor way of achieving UN recognition, because it now, as I say, puts the obligation firmly on the Security Council to enforce and recognise statehood and UN membership. We don't know when this is going to happen, maybe already by the end of this year. It depends very much on the constitution of the Security Council, which will change. Some of the states will go off at the end of 2014, some new ones will come on. The primary mover of this is Jordan, which has been a non-permanent member of the Security Council since the beginning of 2014, remains there until 2015. And Australia is on the Council as a non-permanent member until the end of this year. So if this comes up this year, Australia has the potential to take a lead here in terms of its reaction to the Palestinian proposal. New Zealand comes on in 2015, so they play an important role if this is postponed until early 2015. Israel is, of course, the only true democracy in the Middle East. It is a beacon of democratic values. It's a country which is a Jewish state, but of which 20% are non-Jewish. It protects the rights of its minorities. It's not perfect by any means, and there are a lot of problems even within Israel. But nevertheless, it is a full, vibrant, democratic economy, and the only one of its nature in the Middle East, despite the fact that it doesn't have significant oil and gas reserves, at least and not until recently. Now, a second aspect is, of course, Israel's military administration since 1967 in the West Bank, what is known as West Bank, known to the Jewish people as Judea and Samaria. These are the territories which Israel took control of in the 1967 Six-Day War: the West Bank, the Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights, and of course the Sinai, which was later transferred back to Egypt. Now, you know, we're all aware that this ongoing military administration of these territories is not satisfactory. It is not a long-term solution. Nobody wants to see the continuation of a situation in which a people, the Palestinian Arab people, are living effectively in the context of a military regime. Now, the Oslo process started in the early 1990s, created the impetus towards the development of Palestinian autonomy, and the area has been divided, the West Bank area has been divided into three areas. Part of the West Bank is fully controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Part of it is jointly controlled by Israeli and Palestinian authorities, and part of it is fully under the control of Israel still. So it's a real dog's breakfast, if you like, in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority has control, as I say, over certain areas, but there are, of course, still major problems within the Palestinian territories. We do have an education system still based and proclamating hatred of Israel and the Jewish people, largely financed by Europe and the West. There are problems of corruption, mismanagement of natural resources. And of course, there are allegations that Israel itself is withholding resources. It's a very complex situation. Now, the other complicating factor is the existence of the so-called Palestinian refugee camps. Since 1948, those Arab Palestinians who fled from what has now become Israel ended up in refugee camps which are run by the United Nations Works and Relief Agency, UNRWA. Now, that several hundred thousand has developed now into second, third generation of 4 or 5 million Palestinian Arabs who are effectively stateless. A new generation, as I say, growing up in an education system which is based on, not on harmony, but on division. This is problematic. These are not true refugees under general international law, but are kept in this refugee system by this unique UNRWA system in the hope that one day they will return, which of course is unlikely to happen. Another complex aspect is the whole situation in Gaza, the rise to power of Hamas since Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005. Now, there has been a slight compromise between Hamas and Fatah and a unity government, but it remains problematic that Hamas is a terrorist organization and is becoming part of the Palestinian governance system. Hamas, of course, closely linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, we also see the dismal failure of the so-called Arab Spring, which everybody thought was going to lead to democracy in the Middle East, is only leading to the rise of Islamic fundamental jihad. We're seeing now the ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and the persecution of Christians and other minority groups throughout the Middle East. Of course, this has already been the case, but it's much more the case now under the rise of these fundamentalist jihadic regimes. So all of this puts another dimension to the idea of the creation of yet another Islamic state in the Middle East, which would be called Palestine. The first thing we need to realise is that the UN itself is not a law-making institution. The UN does not make law. Where does international law come from? Well, international law is very different from a national legal system. International law is the law of nations. It is created by nations. And the most important way that nations create law is through treaties. Treaties are binding because they are entered into consensually. Nations consent and agree to undertaking certain obligations upon themselves, and therefore they become bound by them. They're also bound by general principles, well-accepted principles of international law. For example, that treaties are required to be complied with, that you cannot use force to achieve the existence of territories and so forth. These are clear principles of international law. Another source of international law are the general conduct of states, by which we can see that they regard themselves as being bound by a certain principle of international law. But that's only the case when all states involved regard themselves as being bound. But this very fact, for example, that a UN resolution, either a General Assembly or a Security Council resolution, states that something is illegal does not make it illegal. Statements of law in resolutions by UN bodies are not binding, they're not definitive. We need to look further. So I would encourage those who use these statements to be very careful. Now, the idea that Israel is illegally occupying the territories which it gained control of in 1967 really came about after 1973. 73, in a way, the year of the October Yom Kippur War, was the turning point, I would say, in relation to the creation of Palestinian statehood. Prior to 73, there was no accepted notion that the Palestinians had a right to statehood. Things changed after the Yom Kippur War. That was the final attempt, if you like, of the Arab nations to wipe out Israel through military means. They then turned really to the United Nations as their platform to achieve by means of international law what they'd failed to achieve through military means. And we saw a whole range of resolutions being developed, and they were being promoted and sponsored by nations like Pakistan, like Jordan, supported by Russia and the former Soviet states. Resolutions requiring Israel to give up all the territories that it took control of in 1967. And Europe at that point in time started to buy into that narrative. Prior to 73, Europe, which of course was still young as a European economic community at that time, had not taken a position. After 73, in response, I believe, to the oil embargoes and to Palestinian terrorism, took upon itself to promote the achievement of a Palestinian state next to the State of Israel. Now, as I say, prior to that, all the UN resolutions and all the accepted statements of international law had not required Palestinian statehood. The most clear statement at that time was the Security Council Resolution 242, which was from November 1967, just a couple of months after the the Six-Day War of June 1967. And that was the Security Council statement which required Israel to negotiate, required Israel and its neighbouring states to negotiate, and not requiring Israel to withdraw fully to the pre-67 territories. It says quite clearly in Resolution 242 that Israel is required to withdraw its forces, some of its forces, from those territories, but not all of its presence and not all of those territories. Now, from the 73, as I say, onwards, essentially we saw the nations giving in to Palestinian terrorism and the Arab oil boycott, and Europe officially adopting the view that the Palestinians have a right to a state based on the so-called 1967 borders, which, as we will see in a moment, are not borders at all. Now, resolutions like these can never override rights and interests which have been previously granted. So a resolution from 1973, for example, 1980, or whenever, can never override rights and interests which were granted to the Jewish people under the Mandate for Palestine as far back as 1922. Under that mandate, the Jewish people acquired rights and sovereignty, arguably, to the whole area of the Mandate territory. We'll come to that in a moment. Now, another area relates to the opinions or decisions of the International Court of Justice. It's very often we see quotations taken from the 2004 opinion of the International Court of Justice on the security barrier, in which the Court of Justice said and stated that effectively Israel is illegally occupying those territories. Now, that was an opinion of the Court of Justice. It's not binding, and it's very important to understand that that opinion was very politically biased. It came about as a result of a political process in the United Nations General Assembly, and I believe the Court of Justice allowed itself to be taken to be a part of that political process. There's more to be said on that on another occasion. So I think it's important to understand that international law is rather complicated and in many respects not as clear-cut as many people would have us believe. Now, the next question we need to look at is the status of the territories that are covered by this new Palestinian state. This new Islamic state of Palestine will cover those territories which Israel took control of in the 1967 Six-Day War. We need to understand that this really is the heartland of the Mandate territory of Palestine. Indeed, for the Jewish people, this is the heartland of biblical Israel. This is Judea and Samaria, which is so often called the West Bank territories. Of course, I'm putting to one side Gaza for the moment and the Golan Heights, and focusing very much on the West Bank area. This is the mountainous territory of Israel. And it is this heartland, really, a mountain area of Israel, which is to become a Palestinian Islamic sovereign state if Mahmoud Abbas will have his way. Now, the Palestinian claim proceeds on the assumption that the Palestinian people somehow own or have a right to sovereignty of these territories. And this is problematic because in fact, the Jewish people are the only people ever to have had a state with Jerusalem as its capital, covering this area of Israel, the mountainous area, the heartland of Israel. It is, of course, all of that area which was the subject of the kingdoms of Israel for so many hundreds of years before the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. So it was Jerusalem, which was a Jewish city. It was Hebron, which was a Jewish city. Bethlehem, a Jewish city. So many of the cities of the West Bank were created, came into existence through the Jewish people when they took control of that area over 3,000 years ago and became sovereign, a kingdom of the Jewish people for so many centuries. Now, with the destruction of the temple in 70 and later the disbursement of the remnant of the Jewish people several years later, the Jewish people went into the diaspora. And for almost 2,000 years, this area was largely irrelevant. Jerusalem was for many, many centuries almost forgotten. And certainly for the last 400 years of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, Jerusalem was hardly on the map. The whole area was simply one little district of an area which was governed by a regime based in Damascus. It was part of a greater Syria, in fact. Now, things changed when the Jewish people started coming home in the late 19th century. Zionism came into being. And the Jewish people, escaping the pogroms and the persecutions of Europe, started to return to their homeland. And of course, they looked specifically to Jerusalem as being the capital. Jerusalem, referred to over 700 times in the Old Testament of our Bible, is the center, the focus, the head of the nationhood of the Jewish people. And of course, Jerusalem is right in the heartland of what is now known as the West Bank, and it is Jerusalem which really is the heart of this conflict. Now, when the First World War came to an end and the Paris Peace Conference took place, the mandate systems were created. And very simply, the mandate for Palestine was designed to enable the Jewish people to have their homeland again. It recognized the pre-existing connection of the Jewish people historically and legally with the land, their right to reconstitute their nationhood in Palestine. And Palestine covered all the area west of the Jordan River, as well as the area east of the Jordan River that is now the nation of Jordan, which was separated off already in 1922. So in effect, what has now become the state of Jordan was originally intended in 1922 to become a territory, a mandate territory, and ultimately a state for the Arab Palestinians. And the West area, including what is now the West Bank, remained under the mandate for Palestine, which was intended to enable the Jewish people to have their homeland. So there is a contradiction, a tension, in fact, a conflict between the claim on the one hand of the Palestinian people to sovereignty or ownership of this area and the pre-existing rights recognised by the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, as early as 1922, that the Jewish people would have this area as their homeland. They weren't to live there exclusively. Others than the Jews were to have civil and religious rights. But in terms of self-determination of nationhood, this was to be for the Jewish people.
Soviet Union, yes. United Kingdom, abstain. The United States, yes.
Resolution
Paraguay,
of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
Resolution 181 in the United Nations General Assembly in 1947 paved the way for the rebirth of the State of Israel in 1948. However, did this give Israel legitimacy?
The answer is no. Generally speaking, in international law, General Assembly resolutions are not binding.
It's a wide myth. There's absolutely no truth that Israel's legal foundation is based on the UN Partition Resolution of November 29, 1947.
If the Jewish people and the Arabs had agreed to enter into a treaty based on the terms of resolution, then rights and obligations could have been created in international law. But that didn't happen.
The legal foundation of modern Israel really is initially traced back to the period right after the First World War, when the great powers at the time and the League of Nations, which was the UN of that particular period, had to decide what's going to happen to various former enemy territories.
Howard Grief began practicing law in 1966. For many years, even before that, he had an interest in Middle East affairs. In the 1980s, he began to examine long-hidden documents in the British National Archives that minuted the San Remo Conference of 1920. As a result, he published the book The Legal Foundation and Borders of Israel Under International Law.
The San Remo Resolution. That is the basic constitutional document of the State of Israel under international law.
San Remo, the Villa de Vacha. This is the place where legal rights were granted. This is the place where legal rights were given to both the Jewish people and the Arab people.
Dr. Jacques Gauthier is an international human rights lawyer. For more than 25 years, his focus has been the legal status of Jerusalem under international law, which was the subject of his doctoral thesis.
It's in this place that the leaders with the power to make binding dispositions with respect to the Ottoman territories deliberated and made the decision, having heard claims from the Zionist organization in Paris in 1919 during the Paris Peace Conference, having heard submissions from the Arab delegation in respect to what they wanted in the Ottoman territories. Having heard these submissions, a group of them gathered here and made final binding decisions in international law as to who would get what.
At San Remo, that what had been exclusively a British approach receives the full backing of the international community. And in that sense, Israel's legitimacy is linked to an international decision at San Remo and not just a whim of British policy.
In 1917, Lord Allenby conquered the Holy Land, and the Jews were promised a national home in Palestine by the Earl of Balfour, a policy endorsed by Woodrow Wilson and by the League of Nations, which made Palestine a British mandate.
In the 1922 Palestine Mandate, the League of Nations together voted on a very special resolution. It decided that they would give recognition to the historic rights of the Jewish people. To do what? To reconstitute their national home. Now, if you look at that language, you see two things. You see they are recognizing a pre-existing right and not creating a new right. In other words, the historical rights of the Jewish people to this land were recognized by the great powers at the time, by the equivalent of the UN at the time.
It was the Jewish people that were chosen to be the beneficiaries of a trust, a mandate under the care of the British government in respect to Palestine. It was the Arab inhabitants of the territories of Mesopotamia, Iraq now, Syria and Lebanon that were chosen to be the beneficiaries of a trust or a mandate. Part of it under the trusteeship of or mandate of the French, Syria and Lebanon, part of it under British supervision, Mesopotamia. I want to underline that the primary objective of the mandate for Palestine was to grant political rights in respect to Palestine to the Jewish people.
The civil and religious rights of the Arabs as individuals were fully protected in the mandate document. But insofar as the national and collective rights and the collective political rights were concerned, these were reserved exclusively for the Jewish people because the Arabs were given those same rights not in Palestine, but in the neighboring countries. And that is why today you have 21 Arab states and 1 Jewish state.
The Second World War brought about the demise of the League of Nations. It was superseded by the United Nations in 1945.
The Charter of the United Nations, which you are now signing, is a solid structure upon which we can build for a better world.
How does this affect the rights of the Jewish people under international law?
In the final resolution passed by the League in April of 1946, it is specified that the intent is that after the dissolution of the League, it is necessary to continue to look after the well-being and the development of the people concerned in each mandate. And for Palestine, that meant the Jewish people.
So the rights that were recognized as inhering in the Jewish people were preserved by Article 80.
There's nothing in the Charter which is to be construed in or by itself as taking away or altering the rights given to any people prior to the establishment of the United Nations. And I refer, for instance, to Article 80 of the Charter.
Following Israel's statehood in 1948, the country was invaded by 5 Arab armies intending to destroy the Jewish state. The eastern part of Jerusalem was annexed by Jordan. The city was divided for 19 years. Jordan's sovereignty over the West Bank and Jerusalem was never recognized by the United Nations. In 1967, Israel recaptured East Jerusalem in a war of defense and later annexed it.
The Security Council Resolution 242 of November 22, 1967 is often referred to as the source of rights and obligations for the parties in the Middle East. If I focus on Jerusalem, I take the position that, again, rights have been granted based on the recognition of historical rights, based on the principle of reconstituting what the Jewish people used to have. The Jewish state and the Jewish people have done nothing to relinquish, surrender the rights that were given in respect to that territory.
Anyone who looks at the census data back in the 19th century when the Ottoman Empire was here will realize that the Jewish people already in the 19th century had restored a majority in Jerusalem, in the old city of Jerusalem. In 1864, the British consulate in Jerusalem actually provided some census data. And they said out of 15,000 residents in Jerusalem in 1863, 8,000 were Jewish. So we're speaking about a city that has been a Jewish city since Ottoman times, since the mid-19th century.
The old city is without doubt the most controversial, the most sought after, the most contentious issue when one speaks of the question of Jerusalem. You have to remember that until the middle of the 19th century, Jerusalem was the old city.
Many who tell Israel to redivide Jerusalem along the 67 lines, and therefore placing the whole old city on the Palestinian Arab side, forget what happened in 1948. 1948, Jerusalem was invaded by 5 Arab armies. There were UN guarantees that there'd be an international city. The UN didn't do anything. Finally, all the Jews of the old city of Jerusalem were ethnically cleansed, forced to leave, and the Arab Legion, along with Palestinian locals, destroyed 55 synagogues and Talmudic academies. They're blown up. Anyone who says to Israel, give up on Jerusalem, has to explain how we'll avoid that history repeating itself. Remember, from 1948 to Till 1967, when Israel reunited Jerusalem, Jews were not allowed to visit the Western Wall. And that is something that Israel is determined to avoid.
After 18 years of a failed peace process in which there is no agreement in sight, the Palestinian Authority has indicated that it will unilaterally seek recognition from the United Nations General Assembly for a Palestinian state within the pre-1967 Green Line and with East Jerusalem as its capital.
The Green Line was simply an armistice line. This is the line chosen between Israel and the Jewish people and the Jordanians when they stopped fighting in 1948-1949. That line, it is specified in the treaty, in the armistice agreement between Israel and Jordan, was never intended to be for anyone the source of rights and obligations.
The original Oslo agreements, the first one in 1993, the big Oslo agreement in 1995, known as the interim agreement, had a clause in them. It was called Article 31. And it said, neither side shall change the status of the West Bank and Gaza Strip prior to the completion of the permanent status negotiations. If the Palestinians try and change the status of the territory without negotiating with Israel, that is a unilateral act which violates this commitment. Now, why is this particularly important for Europe? Because when the interim agreement was signed with that critical clause, at the White House in the presence of President Clinton, the European Union signed the agreement as well as a witness. And therefore, if EU countries decide to support the Palestinian move in the UN in contravention of that Palestinian commitment in Oslo, what they're essentially doing is lending a hand to a violation of a written agreement to which they are also signatories. So the immediate question in Israel will be, who would ever rely on the European Union again to be involved in the peace process if it violates the very agreements that it itself signed? The whole world is saying to Israel, well, why don't you recognize the rights of the Palestinians to a Palestinian state? It seems elementary, and Israelis hear this all the time. But put the shoe on the other foot. Do you see anybody telling the Palestinians, you must recognize the rights of the Jewish people to a nation state of their own, whose roots are in international legitimacy and international proposals going back to San Remo and to the British mandate by the League of Nations? Unfortunately, that same demand is not made of the other side, and perhaps exposes its real intent.
Many gathered here in Rome, senators, members of parliament, to discuss issues relating to the peace process. Yes, many are concerned about decisions that the nations could be making in the coming weeks and months relating to the rights of the Jewish people, the rights of the State of Israel, in respect to Jerusalem, in respect to disputed territories. In order to give peace a chance, it is necessary to honor the solemn pledges made under the law of nations to the Jewish people and the State of Israel.
Now I come to the last problematic aspect of this latest Palestinian initiative to seek recognition of Palestinian statehood. And that is the fact that it really depends upon removal of the Jewish people from these territories as an integral part of this new statehood. Okay, so what the Palestinians are saying is that not only do they want statehood, but they want removal of all Israeli settlements, which in effect means removal of all Jewish people from those territories. Now, there's something fundamentally objectionable about the fact that the Palestinians make no secret of their intention to evict all Israelis from their new state. It's implicit in the requirement to remove the settlements, But they've also stated it, Abbas has stated it quite clearly, that there's no place for the Jewish people in this new state of Palestine. Now, this amounts to nothing less than ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian territories, so-called Palestinian territories of Jews. Let's not forget that these territories are at the heart of really the Jewish biblical heartland of Israel. This new Islamic state would be based on a principle of discrimination. Now that is apartheid. And whatever criticism might be levelled at Israel, and it's often accused itself of being an apartheid state, it does not exclude non-Jews. On the contrary, as we've seen, about 20% of the Israeli population are non-Jews. They enjoy full rights of citizenship in the state. Now, with the rise of Hamas, ISIS and radical Islam in the Palestinian territories, as well as the nations around them, we have a real threat that all minorities in this new state of Palestine will be in danger. Not only the Jewish people, but also Christians and any other minority group. This is something that the international community should avoid and prevent at all costs. So to conclude, we've seen a number of reasons why this initiative of the Palestinians to seek Palestinian statehood should be rejected at this particular point in time, and we've said that this is not something against the Palestinian people as such, but we simply have a conflict between the position taken by the Palestinian leadership and the creation of a new Islamic state on the one hand, and a pre-existing position of Israel, the Jewish people, on the other. And the only way to resolve these conflicting interests is through the process of negotiation. It's a fundamental principle upon which this conflict is going to be resolved if true peace is going to be revealed and achieved. Now, we can even go further, I would say, and say that given Israel's position and its existence really as the only democratic state and the only thriving economy in the region, instead of being a threat to peace, Israel is potentially the motor for true prosperity and peace in the region. Instead of taking steps which threaten the existence of the Jewish state of Israel, the international community should be taking whatever steps are necessary to support, protect, and encourage what is in fact the only truly democratic nation in the Middle East at this time. Israel is the sole bearer in a sea of Islamic nations around it, being overtaken or threatened to be overtaken by radical Islamic elements. Israel is the bearer, the holder of those same Judeo-Christian values upon which Western society is valued, and as such it is our true ally in the region. Thank you.